In this episode, I want to dive into the assessment part of C cases a bit. Basically, at first I'm going to talk about cases, then I'm going to talk about dials, and then I'm going to show a couple of watches to show how a proper C case should look like. This is a restored case example. The case has been completely restored. How can you tell a restoration? First of all, in this watch, it is apparent on the case back. The case back is placed on a rotary tool and it's spinned at high speeds, and then it is touched on these places. And on this watch, you can see the diffusal a bit here. It's not completely uniform. It goes from polished to carved in these areas. Also, you can see that the case back has been polished in these places. Actually, this is kind of a professional restoration, and normally it is much more apparent. The base case, the upper case has been done very well. The lines have been done well, but you can tell on the lower right corner a bit, the lines aren't perfect here. And if you look at the bezel should actually be flat, but you can see that this has been polished quite a bit, or it has been replaced with an aftermarket production, so it's actually now quite aimed, so it should be flat. You can also see that the crown is not original, and around the crown area the polisher failed, the refinisher, let's say, failed to finish the case around these areas. So this was a restored case example, and it's actually one of the well done cases. And another thing to talk about is the crystal ring. Normally this should be what I assume is like a white gold coated brass, but they stripped the coating entirely from the armor ring, and now it looks like bare brass. I actually don't know what the material exactly is, but what I assume it is brass from the color. So it's an interesting creation. I think maybe even the hands are similarly stripped from their original color, but it is probably a gold colored dial instead, and the dial itself looks original to me. It looks original because it is very stained here. If the restorer redialed this too, I think he would get rid of the stain, so this dial looks original to me. Now I'm going to show a restored dial. So basically, if you are intending to buy a C case, you should be able to spot redials, and they are very obvious. And because the C case is actually quite water resistant by design, these watches survived very well. So not many of them are redialed. Even if they take water from the crown area, it usually doesn't reach the dial area, and even if it reaches the dial area, it usually leaves a uniform patina, probably because it evaporates. So it is usually in a sellable state even if that occurs. But this is one of the rare redial examples. You can most obviously tell from the minute marks. The minute marks are very badly done. You can tell from the Swiss made typography and placement. Actual C cases can have split Swiss mates, but this one is obviously not original. You can tell by the placement, but C cases are again how can I say it, an oddity, let's say. They have a lot of different placement for Swiss mates, but this is not one of them, and also they are a bit small. Also the fonts are quite off. You can tell this by looking at a lot of watches. and afterwards you are able to tell when they are right or not right. You can do the MOY test on C cases, where you draw a line here and see where the MO and Y crosses this line. Most of the original dials don't adhere to that rules. You can tell it's a redial by, again, minute marks. Minute marks shouldn't exceed these indices. Anyway, actually, when buying C cases, you should rarely be worried whether it's a redial or not. Maybe like 0.5% of watches in the market for C cases are redialed. There are other tells for redialed watches because these restorers approach things very bad. You can tell on this watch they polished the case back as well. I mean, it's very easy to not touch the case back, but it shows that how little they care about these watches. This part isn't going to be very comprehensive, but I just want to show how C cases defy even Omega's rules. I believe that when Omega released a new batch of C cases, they made a singular change on the dial at each dial iteration. So they didn't produce the same dial twice, is what my belief is. For this reason, there are small differences on typography, how the constellation font appears. For example, on this watch you can see that the constellation has flat ends, but originally on original models it has curled ends. The ends curl quite a bit inwards, and in this model you can see that it is very obvious to flat. And one thing you should pay attention to is the Swissmate part. It's the Swissmate text. And if the crystal is original, when you look at the watch head-on, you should read the Swissmate T part, and it is a good place to look at because on the dials it is written quite badly usually, so it's an easy tell. But what is interesting is that the placements also changed quite a bit on different models. For example, this is a tritium model and it has T markings, and you can see that the Swiss and Mate are separated. So even if you show this watch to an Omega collector, he can claim that it's a redial if he hasn't seen many C cases, because Omega didn't make many split Swissmate dials, but on C cases they exist and they are very regular. Here's what I'm talking about. Normally this Swissmate is not separated, so the S has the tritium marking. I'm sorry about my nails, I did a bit painting recently. There's paint in my nails. This is another example. This has combined Swissmate and the T markings. And also this watch is interesting because it doesn't have T markings. It's a tritium model, but it doesn't have the T markings. So tritium watches doesn't necessarily need to have the T markings. These are all original. Let's look at the cases a bit, the case lines. Actually, this case could be restored. I'm really not sure, but if it's restored, it's really well done. Basically, when you look at these case lines, they should be circular and all uniform, but maybe this case is professionally done. but it doesn't matter if it's done well. I'm going to show an example where it's done very badly and it matters in these cases. I think cases in these raw shapes are actually better than restored cases, like the one I first showed in this video. Now let's look at some problematic watches. Here is a very sad case illustration on an otherwise perfect watch. Some sellers apply a Scotch-Brite like polisher or refinisher to improve the looks in their minds, but it actually leaves these cross marks on cases. You can see the lines aren't perfectly circular and they cross each other. The deepness of the scratches are different, so they refract the light differently, and you can tell that it's not perfect. I have a replacement case coming for this watch soon. The case is actually in good shape. Otherwise, the side lines are sharp, so it just needs a decent refinishing on the upper case. But it's a good idea to check how the case reflects the light. On steel cases, I don't think it matters much because it's easy to find loan cases for replacements and you can refinish them. But on gold watches, especially white gold watches, it is very, very important, because on those watches the case value is actually quite high, but on these watches the case value isn't that high and it's easy to find replacements. Now I'm going to show a very, very bad example of how a not original crystal, a replacement aftermarket crystal in the wrong dimensions, can affect the watch. This is normally a perfect watch, but the seller in his mind tried to improve the looks. It probably had a raw crystal, but it was all original, and you can see that he did polish the case back. I think the case back is in good condition, but what he did is that if you look at this original crystal, you can see the dome going up, and it has a specific dome shape, but on the crystal he used, you can see that the dome doesn't go directly up, so it goes a bit like this. To make up for the space, he bent these hands so the hands clear the crystal. So on these C cases, the crystal geometry and having an original crystal or having a crystal in original dimensions matter quite a bit. You can tell that a crystal isn't original by the gap. If the armoring isn't original, it can leave a gap. Actually, if on fake crystals there is no gap, so you can tell if the crystal is fake by the missing gap. But I think a fake crystal is better than a crystal like this, and a modification like this. It will be quite hard to restore these hands. Luckily, there is a seller recently appeared that sells these tritium hands. Otherwise, it's extremely hard to find hands for C cases. Sadly, this seller or the watchmaker also scratched this perfect dial. So these are some things that you should look on watches. If the crystal isn't original, if it doesn't have the Omega logo in the middle, it can actually result in modifications like this. So the main reason in my mind, the main advantage of having an original crystal is, one, saving the dial because the dial presses on the crystals armoring, and secondly it can actually usually mean that the hands are slightly modified to make up for the wrong dimensions of the crystal. Another thing you should check is whether the hands are original, and you should check whether the star is aligned at the top. On this watch it is upside down. It's easy to correct stars like this, but I actually like this watch a lot, so I didn't correct it. You can just turn the star and maybe apply a little bit of UV resin underneath so it doesn't turn again, or another type of glue. You should check the minute marks to see whether they are all there. On these sunburst dials, you should check whether the dial has any flaking. For example, you can see a little bit of flaking at the 5 o'clock in this. These gray dials are especially very prone to flaking, and this one is actually top condition. It has very minimal flaking. If you look closely, most of them have little flaking and some of them can have very significant amount of flaking. And it's probably because of being handled in a bad way. Probably watchmaker stress indices touch them. It's my theory that this causes flaking. It could also be caused by maybe temperature movements, heat cycles, but I believe it's from mishandling. So basically this concludes the assessment video. I hope it's at least somewhat useful. It's not as comprehensive as I wanted, but I hope it includes some useful pointers that you should check. I maybe bought 100 C cases, maybe more, and even now I make a lot of mistakes. For example, last year I bought a watch that has a section missing on constellations N. I didn't see it at the time, so you should check every part of the dial rigorously. Even if you're experienced, it's easy to make mistakes. You get very excited when you saw a rare watch and forget even to check each detail, but they should be checked. But most people also don't care that much about the details. For example, there was a collector friend who bought a blue dial. It had a wrong logo, but he didn't mind even that wrong logo. So even you should check the logo itself. The logo also has two different kinds as far as I remember. This one has curled ends. The older ones has flat ends. You should check the crowns. So there's a lot of things to check, but at least I hope this video is a starter on what you should check, even if it's not a comprehensive list. I hope to someday prepare a comprehensive list and maybe a grading system for C cases. Each watch I believe should be different. For example, on C cases the case details are different, the bezel details are different, the dial details could be different. For example, indices are coated. If their coating is damaged, it could reduce something like, for example, 2 points from the dial system. If one of them is, let's say, damaged a little bit, it could reduce 2 points, and if multiple of them are damaged, it could reduce the dial point system to half of what it should be. So I believe there could be like a formula, a complicated formula that you can go through and calculate, enter into the system each detail and each checkpoint, and it could result in a watch grade. Let's say this watch could grade, I think, a 7.5. If the star is corrected, probably an 8. Anyway, I'm talking too much, but let's conclude this video at this point.